our series is called Kal Se Kal Ki Taraf, uh, from yesterday towards tomorrow, which explores the relevance of ideas, ideals, and principles of Indian thought leaders of the yesteryears and sees live examples of their applications manifesting around us. These are valuable conversations, especially given the multiple crises India and the world are going through right now, and attempts to co-create a vision for a collective future. So with this vision, this is the sixth episode that we are doing today. In the past, we have spoken about other thought leaders, such as Gandhi, Savitribai Phule, and others. All of them are available on our Vikalp Sangam channel. You can go and watch them as well. Today, Shrishti will be uh, leading the conversation with Aseem. And before we begin, I would like to just give a brief introduction of Shrishtee. Shrishtee Bajpai is a researcher, writer, and activist based in India. Her work focuses on the intersections of environmental justice, social justice, and more than human governance. She is a member of Kalpavriksh, an Indian environmental action group, and helps coordinate the Vikalp Sangam process. She's also a core team member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, a global platform connecting movements for social and ecological justice. So with this, I will hand it over to Shrishti, who will take forward the conversation.
Thanks, Chandra. Okay, so welcome everybody who has joined us today from different parts of the country, and most importantly, our speaker today, Aseem Shrivastava. Thanks, Aseem, for agreeing to be in conversation with us. And it's always so lovely to hear you speak and so much to learn from when you share your thoughts. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation as well. But before we start it, I just want to introduce you, and then we can begin our conversation. Also, for the audience that
briefly, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. And also for the audience that we have about an hour, maybe now 55 minutes for this conversation. And for the first 40 minutes, Aseem and I will have a conversation. I have some questions for him, which he will um, share his thoughts on. And then we'll open this up for all of you to also reflect and ask your questions, comment, and yeah, share your own thoughts about this conversation. Um, so Aseem Shrivastava is a writer, teacher, ecological thinker with a doctorate in economics, and he has taught at several universities in India and the West, and courses around on global and Indian ecosophy. And he is author of several books, one being called Churning the Earth with Ashish Kothari, and the others that he's currently working on, which sounds super interesting, and maybe some elements of it will also come in today's conversation, namely Ecosophy, the Grammar of Greed, Reflections on Fatal Ecology, the Alphabet of Ecosophy, a Morphology of Twilight Modernity, and For the Love of the Earth, Modernity, Ecosophy, and Rabindranath Tagore. All of these works dialogue with ecological challenges of 21st century global modernity. So there's a lot to unpack here, Aseem, especially the concept of ecosophy, and why do you bring in ecosophy in connection with Rabindranath Tagore. And as in our conversation earlier today, you mentioned that you would also like to bring in another thinker in this conversation. So I guess just like me, the audience here must also be wondering why this session is titled as Rabindranath Tagore as an ecosopher. And so I'm curious to know why you do so and what is ecosophy. And Panikkar, the thinker that you want to also introduce us, how his work and his ideas on ecosophy are linked to Rabindranath Tagore. So maybe there are several questions in this one question, but yeah, feel free to begin, or whichever thread do you want to start with.
Thank you, Shrishti, and thank you, Kalpavriksh and Vikalp Sangam for organizing this. Is the audio level okay, Shrishti? Yeah. So for the past about 30 years since I did my doctorate in the US, and I did the doctorate in economics, I've been in search of something which I did not have a word for in the past. I've only sort of discovered this language in the last decade or so. And a senior friend of mine who's passed on now, Kishore Sant from Udaipur, he used to use the expression Yug Sankat Bodh. So Yug Sankat Bodh, for those of you who don't follow Hindi or Sanskrit, is basically awareness and wisdom for a time of crisis. This is basically the sum and substance of it. And in the last 10 years, I feel that I have found what I feel is necessary as an overall sort of worldview for our times. And, philosophy traditionally has remained relatively insulated from ecology and environmental concerns. And ecology has been largely, sort of separated from philosophy, right? We are now living in times where ecology cannot evade philosophy for all sorts of reasons, and nor can philosophy avoid ecology. So at the very least, we need an ecological philosophy to inform our sort of overall cosmology today, in which everyone lives. And it has to be globally relevant, which is to say, some sort of universal values should be there. And it should be plural enough to accommodate an endless range of diverse cultures which the world has. So while we speak about unity in diversity and diversity in unity, actually I've not heard that for a long time. But we should actually bring that idea back, and plurality of every sort has to be sort of encouraged within a larger universal sort of umbrella. Now, the traditional way of handling the environment, right, is that we keep modernity stable and intact, and we look at the environment as outside us, and we develop a modern sort of view of the environment, of nature, and so on, which means science is the dominant worldview there, right? Because science is our modern way of understanding nature. And so that becomes the basis for the entire cosmology of modernity, right? But what ecosophy argues, and what I've been learning over the last decade or so, is that much more than, rather than having a modern view of the environment, what we need is an ecological understanding of modernity. It's a whole different paradigm of thought. And that is what took me to Raimond Panikkar, who I can say a few words about because most people will be unaware of him in India. Strange because Panikkar is actually, his father was from Kerala and his mother was from Catalonia in Spain. He grew up in Spain, but he grew up multilingual. He spoke about 10 or 12 languages, I think. And he wrote, I think he did his work in at least 4 languages. And he was well versed in Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and so on. So he was quite a scholar. He had 3 different doctorates in philosophy, theology, chemistry. So an extraordinarily learned man who actually influenced a lot of people, but only in Europe mostly. In India, he used to visit Sarnath in Banaras and spend some time there almost every year in his later years. So Panikkar's books, and there are dozens of books, I'll only mention 2 here, The Rhythm of Being and Cultural Disarmament. Those are the 2 books which I'm well aware of and familiar with, and I've been teaching from. They actually do give us a perspective on modernity from an ecological angle. And this is new. This is very new. So it argues, basically, his work argues that we need to reconfigure the entire cosmology of life in the modern world. So that's not a challenge which is taken up either by environmentalism or by ecology. By and large, the understanding is that, if we treat nature better, we can actually make wiser use of it, and it will serve us in turn better. And what Panikkar argues is that we need a much deeper change, a much deeper mutation, because the crisis is as much in our consciousness as it's out there in the world, institutionally, structurally, socially, culturally, politically, and so on. So we're living in a time of crisis. And for such a time, we need to really rethink just about every concept through which we understand the world. So that's what makes it very different from ecology and environmentalism. Now, most of you would be aware of Rabindranath's last testament, which in Bangla is called Shobhitar Shankat, which means crisis in civilization. And this is something which he, recorded. It was played on the radio a few weeks, I think, before his death in August 1941. And I'm just going to read to you what he said on that occasion, because it's prescient in terms of what he was able to foresee about the world in which we have been living in for a long time, as long as most of us have been alive, actually. So this is what he says. And remember, 1941 is a moment in the middle of World War II, right? And this is just before Pearl Harbor happens. So he says, quote, "As I look around, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. And yet I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in man. I would rather look forward to the opening of a new chapter in his history after the cataclysm is over and the atmosphere rendered clean with the spirit of service and sacrifice. Perhaps that dawn will come from this horizon, from the east, where the sun rises. A day will come when unvanquished man will retrace his path of conquest, despite all barriers, to win back his lost human heritage." So I share this as an instance of his total, complete disillusionment with modern Western civilization. Now, Gandhi, those of you who've read Hind Swaraj, knows that in 1909 itself, he was talking about modern civilization as a 9 days wonder, right? But Tagore actually had a bit more faith in the West and had a lot more contact with the West on a regular basis in the period of the freedom struggle. Gandhi, once he returned to India, was so buried in the politics of the nationalist movement that his contact with the West was actually relatively thin compared to Tagore. Tagore actually started traveling only in his 50s, by which time Gandhi had more or less stopped traveling outside India. So they had opposite sort of trajectories in relation to the West. If you look at Tagore's renunciation of his knighthood after Jallianwala, that actually is provoked not just by Jallianwala, it's also provoked by a genuine deep disillusionment with the West after the Great War. Remember, the World War I was called the Great War before the Second Great War happened, right? So his visit to the battlegrounds of Europe after the war pained him so much that he lost all faith that Europe is capable of civilizing the world, And from 1919 onwards, for the last 20, 22 years of his life, his writings reflect this. And, the sense that this is a civilizational crisis. This is not just a crisis of culture or of capitalism or one or another segment of society. The entirety of human civilization is in crisis. Now, that's what we call in our language in India, drishta, somebody who sees into the future because he can see quite deeply into the present, right? And so there's a lot of writing in Tagore after the 1920s, which is quite prophetic in its overall sort of mood. So what sort of makes me look up to these two figures as our teachers, and people should be reading them very, very seriously now, is because Tagore, while born 2 generations before Panikkar, is seeing all the things that Panikkar is writing about. And Panikkar is seeing all the things that we are sort of experiencing. Panikkar died in 2010 at the age of 92. So he lived through the 20th century, after 1918. So what they're able to see before, as I like to think of it, before the train enters the tunnel, is something very valuable because they have seen the real sky. Once the train enters the tunnel, those of us born under the mountain in the tunnel have to imagine the sky. And this is the difference between the world before the Great War and the world after, I think most historians would agree that the Great War, the First World War, is actually the moment of the deepest disillusionment with modernity, with modern civilization in the Western world. So Tagore lived through all that, and so his understanding of the ecological crisis is right from the very beginning. And he was talking about it actually from the 1890s onwards, incidentally, before anybody else, certainly in India and even outside, was talking about it. Their sort of deep sense of anxiety about the future is there. And, they both ask for a huge mutation in consciousness, basically. And they use different words for it, but they mean things which are not so different. So I will just, point to those words because they're complex words and they require a lot of thinking and elaboration. So Panikkar uses the word metanoia, metanoia. And what it means in the sort of Christian tradition is so meta plus nous, nous, gives you metanoia, So it's a kind of knowledge or awareness which is pre-mental, pre-intellectual, pre-cognitive, right? And it involves the heart, it involves the soul, right? And he's saying that we need to repent because that is what metanoia suggests. We need to repent for all that we have been living because this is not the way to live, right? So penitence is very much a part of it. And more than anything else, we need to repent to Mother Earth. Rabindranath uses the expression Chotto Vedana. So Chotto Vedana in Bangla refers to, so those of you who know Sanskrit, chhati, you understand sort of heart, right? Vedana, pain, but also a kind of knowledge, right? A pain, there's a beautiful word in Hindi for it, marm, right? So marm is a very meaningful kind of suffering or pain. So one needs to go through that before you ask the question of, so what's the solution, right? Today, impatiently in a solutionist era, in a sort of technocratic, time, we want answers, we want solutions. And both these thinkers are saying there are no solutions if you're not willing to first understand the damage that has been going on and that continues to be happening, right? If you're going to want to retain those habits of life and thought, then whatever solution will come from within that mindset is only going to hide the problem, mask it better, and generate new problems once the solution is applied. So that's the perspective which is shared by both thinkers. It's the sort of idea of an ongoing crisis, a deep crisis in human affairs, which is not going to go away with our deaths, which is going to continue for a long time. And it has to be understood why we are in this sort of predicament.
Thanks, Aseem. Maybe just to understand this last point that you mentioned about Tagore talking of our ethical duty to Mother Earth, in some ways of how do we begin to think about solutions is first to figure out how do we repent for our excesses, right? And so as a young person, but also I guess anyone who is interested and who is feeling what's happening in the world, what is it, what it would mean in the times that we are living in to think about our presence in this world? What is our ethical duties? What do we do to amend what is happening? And how do we be present in the kind of world we are living in as young people? And what these times call for us to do in terms of more, yes, understanding the crisis itself, but also truly feeling it, what you were also mentioning earlier today in our conversation.
Mm. Well, everything has to change. It's not this or that. Literally everything has to change. Mutation in consciousness is a huge thing. J. Krishnamurti, by the way, used to use the same expression, mutation in one's consciousness. And a total mutation, he would say, is what we need. Now, this involves living differently. I mean, that's most important. That means, in Panikar's language, purification of the heart. This is not something which modern education is keen to impart at all. Purification of the heart is a kind of an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy thing, which priests would talk about and so on. But Panikkar is quite clear that without that, there is no point in either thinking or doing, and whatever you do will be corrupted by the impurities of the heart. Now, so that is at one level, which I think is terribly important, the level of heart and conscience and, clarity and cleanliness and hygiene there. Not easy at all, as any of us who struggle with our natures knows, not easy at all. Incidentally, both these thinkers have another thing in common, which is that they both think in terms of human beings as potentially higher than nature. However, the only way to transcend nature is to first embrace it. This is the difference with modern thought, because modern thought and practice tempts us to actually transcend nature through technology, right? Build machines, better machines, more efficient machines, faster machines, smarter machines, etc. And that'll allow us to liberate ourselves. And both of them are in agreement that this is false. This is exactly what is so dangerous. One needs to go out of the entire technocratic paradigm of thought to be able to see why this is so dangerous. Yeah? The entire sort of system of education, modern education, not just in India, but throughout the world, is broadly technocratic today, which is to say, science and technology set the bar. They set the standards for what is knowledge, how it is to be obtained, why other forms of knowledge are of a lower pedigree, and so on. So there's an entire sort of hierarchy of knowledge in which we are trained to believe, right? And both these thinkers will say this is dogma. This is dogma of the worst kind. In fact, Panikkar has a beautiful line in Cultural Disarmament where he says, the will is the first dogma of modernity, and the will to power is the most obvious evil that emerges from that. Now, for young people, I think I don't have to tell you this, you know this already. Little things like planting a sapling or a seed, and watching it grow into a plant are of significance. These little things are not so little in their meaning and in their unfolding, right? Before you protest against, deforestation or anything else, doing these things actually is transformative for us, and that personal element is very important to ecosophy. Now, Rabindranath, for example, to give you, the background for him, in Shantiniketan, which he inherited from his family, when he went there in around 1900, when he moves there, it's red, dry, laterite soil, of Birbhum. And if you go to Shantiniketan today, it's not like that. It's quite green, actually. Even after 100 years, 120 years of Rabindranath actually doing massive planting or leading all that afforestation, there are hundreds of banyans and peepal trees and so on, right? So this didn't happen by itself. This had to be done through collective effort, people participating both in the school as well as in Vishwabharati University when it was set up. And Rabindranath had created these festivals, Brikharopan, tree planting, Halakarshan, plowing, ceremony, Barsha Mangal, before the monsoon, planting and so on. So there was a whole sort of calendar of practices which Rabindranath initiated to actually change the landscape. And I think that kind of thing, what in sort of somewhat promiscuous, flirtatious language today we will call placemaking, he was well ahead of his time in doing that. So he had anticipated that India, if it has to have a future, has to pay deep attention to its countryside, to its forests, has to restore the balance towards the villages and the forests. Even in those days, he was seeing that when only 10% or less of India was living in the cities, right? He writes a tract which is very important, I think, and which is unjustly obscure, Robbery of the Soil, in 1924, in which he talks about the egotism of the city, how the city doesn't care about the village, how the city would rather ride roughshod over the countryside and use it as mere hinterland for labor and resources. He talks about modern civilization having become a vast catering establishment. Those are his words. And then he never, so far as I'm aware, even once in his entire life uses the word development. This is very important. Neither Gandhi nor Rabindranath use the word development. He talks about Polli Punargathan. Polli Punargathan in Bangla means, crudely put, village reconstruction. That's a very, very different idea. Village reconstruction, what is that? In a sort of, if you're in the ideology of progress, then villages are an advance on the jungles and towns and cities are an advance on the villages. And that's how we proceed from Nagaon to Nagpur to New York, So, the sort of progress in time and movement in space, they happen at the same time. And they lead to something very devastating, which in my forthcoming book, I'm calling, this is my word as far as I know, I call it deplaciation. So deplaciation is when places turn into abstract spaces which are exchangeable on the property markets. And in a time when a property dealer is running the planet, all places run the risk of getting deplaciated. So do this little thought experiment for yourselves and ask yourselves, what would happen if you stay in your own city? Let's say you stay in Pune, right? And you don't move from there for the next 10 years. However, everybody around you starts to move, right? Your neighbor changes, your friends leave. Everybody in the city is different after 10 years. So this is a sort of a ship of Theseus kind of exercise. What happens to Pune? How culturally stable can it be with such a rapid velocity of circulation of people? And this endangered cultural stability is very much related to the ecological crisis. Because once we lose our places, we lose our sense of belonging. We think that any place is exchangeable for any other place, any person is exchangeable for any other person. We start to live in a replaceable world, right? Whereas each person is unique and indispensable, and each place should be unique and indispensable, but that's not something that market modernity honors in the slightest, right? The entire point is to make everything equivalent in some dimension to everything else, and measurably so, and then a price tag attached to it in a time when you've decided to barcode the planet, right? So, I think that the first sort of sacred duty of our times is to understand our own movements and why we become so restless. Elizabeth Colbert, the environmental writer from the US, she uses a very powerful phrase. She says, Faustian restlessness is what we are trapped in now. And Faustian is referring to the legend of Faust. I won't go into the story here, but somebody who's terribly successful and terribly miserable at the same time. Sounds familiar? So with that sort of discontent at a psychic level, you're always going to think the grass is greener, life is elsewhere, Milan Kundera, And if you are on that sort of a mind, which you have the right gadget for in your hand to promote, then you're living, with a culturally radioactive weapon in your pocket, And then that can lead to some pretty devastating environmental consequences. And notice the number of times that people, without any awareness, say, "Oh, I won't have to live to see that," or you can always go somewhere else. You can always move somewhere else. So, what is modernity teaching effectively? It is teaching escape in the name of freedom. This has got nothing to do with freedom whatsoever. This is entirely about taking the liberty to escape and run away. So taking responsibility for people and places, community, ecology, all those things which many of you are doing, I think, but which require a certain kind of stable commitment. Instead of saying, I can do this, I can do that, I have so much to do, etc., and you want to do everything except some of the obvious things which you can do right where you are. So this kind of restlessness is something which has to be faced. And in my book, I discussed this at some length. Panikkar has a very nice word for it, which he coined. He called it technochrony. So chronos, so that is the root, technochrony. So technology allows us to artificially accelerate our lives. So what we are doing is we are stressing the earth, which is to say we're going 5 miles under the earth looking for coal and petroleum. And we are stressing ourselves in the final event because we are able to create with those energy reserves, technologies, batteries, and so on, with which you can run a remote controlled economy at, high speed and, disturb everything in ecology and culture. So Panikkar says that we've fallen out of sort of sync with the rhythms of the earth, a term which Rabindranath also uses incidentally in The Religion of Man and in several other places. He talks about rhythm. And so what does freedom mean to these people? So that song which you heard before we began, Ei Akashe Amar Mukti Aloe Aloe, Amar Mukti Dhulaye Dhulaye Ghashe Ghashe, Dhulaye Dhulaye Ghashe Ghashe, we're referring to the dust and the grass, that my freedom is there. Now, what modern political sentiment will make you think that? You're supposed to rise above the mud of the earth, right? I mean, the entire idea of freedom, including in Karl Marx and others, right, is about actually liberation from nature. And this is what I'm saying, that the entire consistent thought in modernity since the Enlightenment has been, actually since the scientific revolution, which precedes the Enlightenment by over a century, since the 17th century, the idea of freedom has been to liberate humanity from nature through technology. And so the conquest of nature is the most powerful, dominant, reigning myth to this day, right? The conquest of nature is one, and its allied slogan, also from Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. With these two things, you have defined progress, and you're living within that paradigm, and you're not able to see what is outside that paradigm. And most of the universe, most of life is actually outside that paradigm. So one needs to unlearn a huge amount of rubbish that has gone in. I'm not against science, nor are any of these two thinkers we are looking at. But science needs to be put in its place. It has its place, it has its uses. For instance, in medical, areas and so on. But it should not be allowed to define the cosmology of humanity. That's where the mistake is, scientism, So there's a huge protest from both Rabindranath, if you read his dialogue with Einstein, if you read the tract Personality, if you read, Sadhana, in all these places, Rabindranath is very critical of science while acknowledging its merits and its necessity, right? And so does Panikkar. But modern elites since the Industrial Revolution have got so carried away by the successes of technology and the power that they have seen accruing to them from it, that the whole ideology and thinking of the era has been defined by that. I mean, today it just takes 6 Elon Musks to buy up all of Indian GDP. That's the kind of inequality we are living with, absurdly astronomical inequality. This is what is dangerous and not sustainable at all. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Aseem. And maybe, I mean, I'm actually tempted to go in two directions, but I'll take this one because you've mentioned it, and I feel maybe there's more that you can unpack there, especially this idea of human liberation that you spoke about. And while reading Sadhana, early this year, actually, when Tagore talks a lot about finding the infinite. And even when I was reading your essay yesterday, that idea is um, so difficult to comprehend, especially because of this abstraction to it. But yet it is simple, in simple in its maybe understanding, not so obviously for somebody like me or others who are totally imbued in modern education. But what does it mean to have this idea of human liberation tied through realizing the infinite? What it is to find infinite in a finite world of resources, and what are these physical, material, metaphysical dimensions of human existence that are tied to it? So maybe I know it's a question with a longer possibly reflection, but maybe if you can briefly reflect on it, and post that we can open it up for others to also come in.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the big question of life. I think what is freedom is not clear to us. It's really not clear to us. And today, the sort of practice of the idea of freedom is effectively consumption and a limitless right to consume. Now, I take it as a postulate, as an axiom that all living creatures, human beings included, actually look for the infinite. We look for something big, something vast, something endless, and something beautiful, truthful, and so on. In our scriptures, for instance, he says Satyam Shivam Advaitam, or Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Rabindranath himself quotes the Upanishads repeatedly on this. He was deeply influenced by the Ishavasya Upanishad. Now, if it is true that human beings, like all creatures, long for the infinite, how do we long for the infinite? Where do we go for sort of quenching our thirst for it, as it were? So if you turn on your television set, you go to the market, okay? And if you watch the commercials carefully, every second or third ad will be about the limitless, The latest coinage I saw from, I think, Mahindra Scorpio ad, the word used is unlimit, or, Mahinder Singh Dhoni will teach you about the beast unleashed and so on. So this is the sort of idea of freedom. It's a bit like, children, running out of school once the last bell goes and the school day is over. And that sort of childish idea of freedom has been deeply, deeply inculcated in all of us, so that even now, our work habits are such that when the day is over, we get a feeling of relief. Oh my God, one more day gone, that sort of thing. What does Rabindranath say about it? And if you read Sadhana carefully or many other tracts, he's saying this life is actually given to us to realize the infinite. That's precisely why we are alive. And the question is how to find it. And the short answer is that we have to find it in a non-physical realm, in a metaphysical realm, in Rabindranath's terms, in a spiritual dimension. But the way to the spiritual dimension goes through the heart, so which means we pay attention to our relationships. where we can experience joy of a certain kind, beauty of a certain kind, truth of a certain kind, if we are able to address that question of the heart. Um, so the whole problem with sort of market or commercial modernity has been that the quest for the infinite has been turned towards the physical material dimension, and bigger buildings, or faster and faster cars, or some such dimension of speed and scale is going to be given to us as what human beings can do, reach for the sky, but the earth is the limit, so limits we don't understand. And for Rabindranath, the entire quest in life, not just in sadhana but throughout his life, the entire quest was to reconcile the finite side of humanity with the infinite. That is what it would mean to realize the infinite. So, in brief, I would say, I remember a poem from William Blake, which many of you will know: to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour, right? So that's how you find it. You find it here, right inside here, not there, So the whole understanding has gone inverted. And this is what I call in my book, again, it's a word I've invented, infiniticity. Infiniticity is the search for the infinite in the physical dimension of life, forgetting the metaphysical dimension altogether. There's no such thing as soul. Even a heart has basically chemical properties. As Stephen Hawking says, human beings are basically chemical scum with certain properties which can be analyzed scientifically. If that is your image of humanity, then I'm afraid you're living in a world which has lost all dignity. So how are you going to attribute any dignity to Mother Earth if you don't feel the dignity even within? And this was a foregone conclusion for Rabindranath. He actually says at one point that the big difference between East and West is that the West thinks that only human beings have a soul, whereas in the Orient, we've always thought the universe has a soul. And ultimately, the point is to bring the human soul, the Jivatma, closer to the Paramatma, the Vidhata, and so on. So Gitanjali is entirely about this. So the entire metaphysical quest has to be restored to its proper place and not be trivialized by quote unquote modern rationality, which has terrible limits and terrible blinders when it comes to perceiving these things. So I remember a line from Pascal, the French philosopher: "The heart has its reasons that reason knows not of." So those are the limitations of reason. Reason is a tool. It's a good tool. It's a good slave, but it's a terrible master. And if it's a slave, you have to ask who the master is. There are two alternatives. There's either power or love. There's no third.
Beautiful, Aseem. And there are so many things I want to also ask, but that much as a moderator, I have the right to. So now I'll open it up for the audience. My request to people would be to raise their hands, and if possible, we would like to hear your voice when you're asking your questions. So please feel free to raise your hands, and hopefully, technologically, it will work. We'll just wait for a few seconds in case anyone has a question. Oh, I see Milind has a question. Milind, are you able to unmute yourself? Hi, Milind. Are you able to unmute yourself? Maybe you can ask your question.
Tell me, you tell me.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, Aseem. Always a pleasure to listen to you. You mentioned, I've actually typed a longish question. I don't know how to shorten it. You mentioned metonia, the idea of repenting, turning away. So far as I can understand, it means turning back towards the idea of sacred, right? The repenting that you have eaten from the tree of knowledge, and now you need to go back to sacred, towards a sort of reunion with God, or that's what I think transformation of consciousness would mean, which I do agree. I mean, that's something which is required, but my fear is, in the Eastern tradition, we speak of enlightenment. I don't know whether they perfectly map on the idea of union with God. This is certainly required and perhaps possible at an individual level. But we are worried about, we need a mutation at the social level and a global level. And one is the question of time, and we are running out of time. So I'm not sure whether it is actually possible, and that makes me very pessimistic. I don't know how you feel about it, and would be interested in knowing what
Yeah,
do you think?
it's a big question. I'll try to be very brief here. I think the reason why this problem has arisen is because of what I like to think of as the, secular fundamentalism of our time. There is such a thing as secular fundamentalism. It's just that seculars are remarkably, spectacularly unaware of it. That's what I found. And that's the reason for the rise of religious fundamentalism, if you ask me. So there's a lot of things to talk about there, which we can't go into here. But when you take a hard atheistic stance and you take it publicly and you call upon the entire edifice of science on your behalf, ignoring the fact that some of the most brilliant and powerful, scientists were actually believers, then you have a problem, So you've controlled public discourse for so long, and you have actually created this problem where it becomes extremely difficult to propose or suggest an interreligious dialogue. Now, Panikkar spent his entire life actually trying to achieve that, and he was well versed in the sort of Christian scholastic traditions. He was an ordained priest, actually. He was well versed with Islam. He was well versed with Hindu scripture, and he would try to bring people from different religions together to speak. But he often got criticized by seculars for actually pandering to religious interests and so on. So that's the source of the problem, if you ask me. And if we do not face it, if we do not face our secular fundamentalism, then let me tell you something. I don't think nature will ever be enchanted for us again. And I don't think humanity has any future in a world in which human pride and human will are the last place where we stop. What used to keep cultures relatively humbler in the past was faith and belief in a greater intelligence, a greater power, and so on. If you listen to the Gayatri Mantra, I mean, what is that? It's basically an invocation to an intelligence greater than the human mind. But the modern mind thinks that there's nothing more intelligent in the universe than the human brain. I'm more inclined to think there's nothing more stupid than the human brain today.
Thanks, Aseem, and thanks, Milind, for your question. Anyone else wants to ask question? Please raise your hands so that we know. Okay, I don't see any hand up. Okay, Pooja has typed, but I can't see her question. Pooja, would you like to ask your question here? If not, then maybe I can just go ahead. So Pooja asks, given the depths of our entanglements between cultural and ecological crisis, how do you contend with the reality that our many so-called solutions remain trapped within the logic of our systems that created it? Where do you maybe locate the conditions for meaningful rupture beyond just resilience towards true transformations?
I'm not sure I follow the question completely. It's
I think Pooja is here. Pooja, would you like to maybe speak and clarify your question? Yeah. Not able to unmute. Oh.
Okay, let me have a go. Look, I mean, they say in America, if you're in a hole, the first thing is to stop digging. The first thing is to stop digging, and the next thing is to understand, you know, what digging is, and we are not able to understand that right now because we are so inside the mindset which the market wants us to have. So, for instance, take restlessness. If most human beings calm down and become relatively stable and equanimous, the market cannot function. Now, one needs to understand this, one needs to speak about it, one needs to discuss it, one needs to change our practices, our ways of living and communicating. Ruptures, big changes are not going to happen without a lot of small changes taking place first. And I'm hopeful that a lot of small changes which are going on right now, with so many millions of people aware of these things to some degree and working in a certain direction, it'll add up to something. And nobody can know what that future will be or how that will unfold. But we need to understand that the direction in which we are moving should at least be somewhat, wise in terms of what I was calling earlier the Yug Sankat Bodh, the awareness one needs for a time of crisis. So you should not be turning your DG set on to, run your air purifiers, for instance, which I saw people do some months back here in Gurgaon. So that is minimally necessary. At a larger level, I think a collective intelligence has to evolve. Before we talk about politics, I don't like talking about politics because we are not mature enough for that yet. You will end up in a shouting match with somebody on social media and just waste your energy and feel negative, which is pretty much the default, which the market also wants from you because it gets higher TRPs for whatever the show is, So, we're living with very perverse sort of values, and the participation in perversity is, quite extensive. And one needs to bring some measure of sort of public hygiene to it, if I may put it so.
Thanks, Aseem. There's one more question by anonymous attendee, so we don't know their name, but the question is, Hinduism is taken to be a unity of diversity. How do we put European ideas, or rather thought rooted in European history, to be out of this unity? Always confuses me.
It's not outside so far as I know. I mean, I don't think, for someone like Rabindranath, it was difficult to communicate with somebody from a Christian sort of background. In fact, one of his closest friends, C.F. Andrews, was a pastor. So there was no issue there. And I think there were a large number of Indians in that generation and even after who have managed to communicate. I don't think, I don't like to use the word Hinduism, but whatever our faith has been in India, I don't think it's in any way, exclusive, but at its best. I mean, I'm thinking of Advaitic thinkers and sages and so on, and take someone like Ramu Gandhi or take a person like Ramana Maharishi. I mean, there is no problem. I mean, there's no problem in communicating across religions, cultures, pluralities of faiths, and so on. The problems may be there from other ends, and there are issues when it comes to Semitic faiths, because monotheistic faiths do tend to be, somewhat intolerant sometimes. But I think there are ways around that as well, provided one is willing to speak and listen. So interreligious dialogue becomes very important. In the absence of that, then violence becomes the default.
There's one more question, Aseem. Is that okay? We take that one. Yeah. So, Devasya has raised their hand. Would you like to ask your question, Devasya?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, you are. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Aseem ji. It was, wonderful talk, wonderful lecture. It's a meditative, I think, reading of our reality, and it's lovely to listen to you after about so many years. I just thought about this, especially putting in context Paniker's Edinburgh lecture, the rhythm of being, rhythm. Isn't the case that modernity unconsciously helps the human mind to know too much, which somehow results in the loss of epistemic humility? In the sense that, then I begin to use things, then myself and other people, everything is for use. The word, the human resources. This just to me is simply unspiritual. How can I use something as my resource? So this is my problem. So can I recover the blessedness of epistemic humility, or the Thomas Kempis would say the cloud of unknowing.
Thanks, Devasya. That's an excellent point. I think that both Panikkar and Rabindranath would smile at this question, because both believe quite deeply in the significance of unknowability. You see, we've been living in this modern Western Enlightenment paradigm for so long, and reason, science, and progress have sort of captured our imagination to the point where knowledge seems to be the only value, and all knowledge is good, and the more of it, the better. There's no brakes on that train, and it's running us into the ground, but we are not noticing that knowledge might be the cause. In fact, Panikkar has this, very interesting, playful metaphor. He says, the Enlightenment sort of mode of thought has a sort of hunting epistemology, which is to search for the truth with the rifle of reason. And once you find the truth, you take aim and you shoot. So, with that sort of epistemic aggression, you will create problems, which is exactly what is going on. I think we are living in an intellectually corrupt era. We are living in an overall corrupt era, but an intellectually corrupt era. It needs to be said that most of our universities are perfectly useless when it comes to actually being humble about what we can know, what we should know, how much we should know, and so on. And this is the difficult thing, isn't it? In most people's heads, once you know, you lose your innocence, right? But the point is there innocence available still, even beyond, in some other dimension? And if it is available, then what is the status of knowledge? If you find joy, why would you want to know a hell of a lot of things? Why do you want to travel heavy with your head? Why not travel lighter and keep only as much as is needed to, can live well, live a good life? The people who I really respect for having lived good lives didn't know very much, but they had a certain innate wisdom and innocence intact. People like my grandmother, or perhaps yours, people who studied till class 2 or 3, and they didn't read Marx and Engels and all this rubbish. So there's a lot of premium placed on knowledge, and I'm not sure if it's the way forward. Panikkar uses a very interesting term, again, one of his coinages. He combines contemplation and action, and he calls it contemplation, which is a bit different from intellection or thinking in a sort of obsessive way, you know. So to be contemplative in a moment of action and to be active in a moment of contemplation, you know, what is that? What would that mean? You know, one has to experience it. So these are all sort of practices of our inner world, which we must become more adept at and bring it closer to one's outer worlds, because right now the chasm is very deep between the two.
Thank you. Thank you.
Aseem, we have two more questions. I think people took some time to warm up. So is that okay? We extend like say 5-10 minutes. Would that be okay with you?
From my side, it's okay.
Okay, cool. So we have Ashish's question. Ashish, do you want to ask it directly, or should I, if you are able to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Hi, Aseem. Great to hear you as always. So my question was, given our very, very deep alienation from the rest of nature, and what we're doing to the rest of nature, the horrific stuff we're doing, you think nature is kind of expressing itself using its own agency in some way to tell us that we have been compromising its freedom, and in doing that, we're compromising our own freedom?
No
And
question.
what are these ways, and how do we listen to it?
Yeah, no question about it in my mind whatsoever. That's my least doubtful, truth. Nature has been speaking for a long time. Panikkar has a very beautiful word. He calls it cosmophony, you know. When nature begins to respond, and we are the ones who are deaf. As someone put it, are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? You know, there's a lot of intelligence which is constantly around us, which we are unmindful of. I'm generalizing because everybody obviously is not like that. But our dominant sort of mainstream sort of tradition in which human beings are at the apex, even after being eaten up by viruses and bacteria, uh, you know, the uh, um, the thinking is, completely warped. And Panikkar's understanding of reality is actually very interesting. He uses, I'm not going to introduce that term here. I'm going to call it with my own name. I call it cosmosis. In my book, I call it cosmosis. And it's a sort of deep, sort of osmotic, exchange with everything alive around you. Everything in creation dances except man. What is the reason? Why do we get so miserable? Why are we so head heavy? Uh, a lot of education is responsible for this. I mean, this is the parrot's training, to use Rabindranath's term for it. And the parrot's training was so successful that, human beings have been turned into those dead trained parrots. So we've been engineered into this level of stupidity at a civilizational scale now. And the smartphone now, promoting that process like a force multiplier. So, Schrodinger, the quantum physicist, used to use the term stupidization, or you might call it idiotization. So this is how we convince ourselves, oh, we are so clever, oh, we are so smart, etc., by comparing ourselves to mute beings, creatures which do not speak human language, but there are 100 other languages in which they are speaking. And not just, animals, but plants, water, rivers. I mean, surely you have seen angry rivers and you've seen sad rivers, you've seen happy rivers, you've seen gurgling brooks. I mean, poets have been noticing it for ages, But you want to prove everything on scientific grounds, it's not going to happen. Science doesn't have the tools for it. In fact, Panikkar says that science is perfectly incompetent for us to relate to nature if nature is anything but, if nature is anything more than an immense machine, So in case nature is more than a machine, how is science going to help you beyond the point? Because the entire process of scientific method is a mechanical process. It's a logical process. It's a quantitative process which measures and computes and so on. But there's something more which is always there. David Bohm, the quantum physicist, he says, whatever we say something is, it's always something more and something different. So if reality is like that in the natural world, how is science going to apprehend it? And if science cannot apprehend it, does that mean it doesn't exist? Far from it. There are other ways of apprehending that. So poetry, music, dance, there's 100 other registers in which human beings can live. But that's what I mean by scientific cosmology having trumped all this out. So that has to go. I mean, I think that the scientific cosmology is causing all the mess.
Thanks, Aseem. There's one more question, and this is possibly the last one we will take, and then we will move towards closing. Chaitali, would you like to ask your question? Can you unmute yourself? Okay. Okay, so I'll ask your questions. Chaitali asks, how can we as sensitive beings meaningfully accept the rapid expansion of AI into almost all aspects of life, a force shaping both our present and the future? How might we not integrate this reality into our own philosophies without losing our deeper human and ecological sensibilities? What insights can we draw from Tagore's thought and work to navigate this transition with wisdom, dignity, and a renewed sense of harmony with the world?
Take a day off every week from your smartphone first. If you can take even 12 hours off from your smartphone every week, you'll be moving in the right direction. I've often sort of played this game with students as to what Gandhiji would say today if he was alive. Now, in his own time, he used to keep a Maun Vrat. How about keeping a media vrat or a screen vrat for 12 hours first? If you can do it for 12 hours, try it for 24, then 36. Unless we learn that, we will never learn actually how to handle this level of technological invasion. And we will not be able to find our way through this jungle of gadgetry. We will constantly feel lost and overwhelmed, which is the idea, mind you. This is always part of the plan. This is always part of the marketing division's plans for us, which is to inundate us to the point where we feel so overwhelmed that we get paralyzed and we can't think our own thoughts, we can't feel our own feelings. They will tell us what to think, they will tell us what to feel, they will tell us how our feet will move, etc. And hey presto, it succeeds most of the time, actually. Well enough for them to feel convinced that they are on the winning side of history. That confidence, let's see, 4 years of Trump might change the decks,
Well, thank you, Aseem, for this wonderful conversation. There's so much to think about, reflect, embody, and we can go on with this. But thanks for again giving this insightful conversation, and so much to think about. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for your good questions, bringing in all the generosity and curiosity in this space, and joining us. I hope you've put your emails in the chat box so that you can stay connected. And as more speakers come in, you can also, know more about how this is unfolding. Before we end, we want to play the song that we started with, that Aseem shared with us. So also sharing this moment together or listening this song again. And maybe we will now hear it differently, having heard Aseem speak about so many aspects to it. I would also like to thank Anchal, Chandra, who managed a lot of things at the background. So thank you again for holding this space. And let's listen to this song collectively. Thanks, Aseem, again. Lots of gratitude.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for listening.
আলোয় আলোয় এই আকাশে আমার মুক্তি, আলোয় আলোয় আমার মুক্তি, ধুলায় ধুলায় ঘাসে ঘাসে এই আকাশে আমার মুক্তি, আলো